you very much. Hello, is this working? Yes, it is. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. You mentioned The Ecologist magazine. When I started The Ecologist, when I started my involvement with The Ecologist magazine, it was about 12 years ago. And for the bulk of my time there, it was almost always the case that if you were sent a report or a letter or something from a climate scientist who disputed climate change, it was almost always the case that if you followed the lead back, you'd end up at Exxon or something like Exxon. And it was very easy in those days. You kind of knew where you stood. The climate skeptics were quite often paid by the oil companies, and everyone else was, as far as we were concerned, saying the truth. Nowadays, it's not quite as straightforward. I have a lot of correspondence with a lot of people. In fact, I got 2 letters this morning from people who are passionately trying to disentangle climate science. They do not believe climate change is happening. They believe it's a grand anti-capitalist hoax, and they're devoting their lives to debunk the science. Now, they're not doing it because they're corrupt. They're not doing it because they're paid by the oil companies. They're doing it because that's what they believe. And I find that much, much harder to understand. Harder to understand, not because of the science. The science is difficult. It's complicated. There's not a scientist in the world who truly understands what the contribution is, for example, of the Amazon to the world's climate. No one really understands completely the positive feedbacks, the negative feedbacks. No one can stand here and tell you what the world's going to look like in 10, 20, 30, 40 years' time. That's not the point. But the overwhelming scientific consensus, and as much as science allows a consensus, is that climate change is real, that we're causing it, and we're going to have to deal with it. That's not the bit that I find hard to understand. You can take umbrage with elements of the science. What's hard to understand is that it's just not rational to devote your life campaigning against action to tackle climate change. And it's not rational for a couple of very obvious reasons. You're meant to say 3. If you're in politics, it's always 3 reasons, but I'm just going to give you 2. The first one is that the steps we have to take to deal with climate change are steps that we have to take even if climate change was not a reality. Now, I just spent 18 months producing a giant, indigestible, vast report for the Conservative Party, which was an environmental policy review. Now, if it was the case that I had been convinced at the end of that process, or even at the beginning of that process, that climate change was not real, the report itself would have remained largely the same. The policy recommendations would have been the same. The introduction and the conclusion would have been different. We'd have used a different language. But the steps that we would have identified, the steps that we did identify, would remain, because we have to take them in any case. Reducing our dependence on oil, minimizing waste, cutting back on or designing waste and pollution out of the way we do business, looking at issues like the collapse of the fish stocks, pursuing policies which will deliver genuine food security, energy security, and so on. These are things we have to do irrespective of climate change. Climate change is just another reason for doing them. So that's one reason I believe that the campaign against action is just not rational. But there's another reason, and that is that to get from a dirty economy, the dirty, wasteful, polluting economy of the sort which we inhabit today, to the kind of clean economy that we're going to have to reach at some point pretty soon, is going to necessarily open huge windows of opportunity. And I think the businesses, the communities, the individuals, governments that recognize that now are going to see the advantages, much more so, I think, than people realize at the moment. Whether the large corporations, DuPont, for example, is a company that we've had endless run-ins with at The Ecologist magazine. I think they've threatened to take us to court at least 3 times. But if we put all that to one side, in their own press releases, they'll tell us that they've reduced their emissions by about 90%, that they saved close to $1 billion on the back of that. They did it for PR reasons initially. They've been rewarded for doing the right thing. The same story is repeated over and over and over again. I went to Denmark recently to talk to the Danish government about climate policy. Now, I didn't know much about Danish climate policy at the time. I was staggered by how much further ahead they are than we are in this country. But what's interesting is that they have a finance minister who is himself skeptical about climate change, but he doesn't care. He recognizes that for Denmark, this issue of climate change opens up an incredible opportunity. Developing clean technologies, microgeneration, decentralized energy, clean information, clean technology across the board, it's become their second biggest export. So he doesn't care whether it's true or not. He knows that by doing the right thing, his country, his economy, is going to be rewarded for doing that right thing. And I think there's an important message in that. If we're wrong about climate change, but we take the steps that I suspect most of us here recognize we need to take, there's no obvious downside. In fact, there's an upside. We'll have a leaner, a cleaner, a stronger, more efficient economy. If we're right about climate change, but we do nothing, it's almost impossible to measure the downside. It's a no-brainer. So when I say it's not rational to spend so much energy trying to stop progress on climate change, I mean that. I read a report in The New Scientist recently describing an experiment on chimpanzees, not something I would normally quote. I'm not mad about the idea of experimenting on chimpanzees, but this particular one I think tells a very powerful story. There are 5 chimpanzees in a room, nothing in the room but white walls and a string hanging from the ceiling with a banana dangling at the bottom and a small stepladder underneath the banana. Now obviously the chimpanzees rushed up the ladder, but the moment they got close to the banana, the room filled with icy water, and they stopped. And they repeated this over and over again until the chimpanzees stopped climbing the ladder and they gave up on their aspiration to get that banana. Well, after a few hours, they replaced one of the chimpanzees. They put a new one in. And the chimpanzee, not knowing about the icy water, rushed up the ladder to reach that banana. But instead of water, they left it to the other chimpanzees. They pulled it down, they dragged it down, they beat the crap out of it, and it learned pretty quickly that it was not worth getting that banana. They repeated the experiment over and over again until eventually there wasn't a single chimpanzee in that room that had ever experienced the icy cold water, and yet none of them went for that banana, and none of them knew why. Now, it seems to me that there is a lesson there when we look at perhaps some of the resistance on the part of our policymakers and some of our commentators when it comes to getting to grips with this extraordinary issue of climate change. Well, I'm optimistic, and I haven't always been optimistic. You mentioned The Ecologist magazine. Well, it is probably the world's gloomiest magazine. I've edited it for 10 years, but the very last letter I received as editor was from one of our older subscribers, and it said, I just can't do this thing anymore. I can't subscribe to the magazine. You'll continue to make a contribution, but I don't want the magazine. It's just too depressing. And I thought, well, how do I answer that? She's right. So I wrote back to her and I said, well, I'm sorry about this. If you find it depressing reading the magazine, you want to try editing it for 10 years. Things have changed. The magazine has changed. I've got a copy here to prove it, much more upbeat. But I'm optimistic because things have changed. They've changed dramatically in the last few years, in a very short period of time. I'm not just talking about the extraordinary Obama election a couple of nights ago, which I think has actually changed the world. You've got, not least because a week ago, most of us in this room would have hated America, and today we probably all love America. It's an extraordinary seismic shift. But not just that. If you walk down the high street, you can see the big retailers. They're competing with one another to outgreen each other. They may have dulled slightly as a result of the economic slowdown or recession or whatever we're calling it, but it's there. If Marks and Spencer's announced its plan A because there's no plan B, they didn't do it for ethical. Well, I don't believe they did it for ethical reasons. I think they did it because they recognized something in society. They recognized an appetite among their customers for things green. They recognize that their customers want to go into their shops and spend money knowing they're part of the solution, not part of the problem. Now, they'll admit themselves that they're nowhere near reaching Plan A, or the aspirations within Plan A, but they're moving in that direction. But I think the fact that they're doing it tells us a good story. And again, even before Obama stormed to victory in the United States, you had a year and a half ago this amazing campaign in America, launched by the evangelical movement, the very people who support President Bush could have counted on unconditionally in the last 2 elections, the evangelical movement. And they've launched a climate change campaign. I've got a sticker in my office that says, "What car would Jesus drive?" And I think there are lots and lots of examples of how things have changed, and quickly, in the last 2 or 3 years. Well, finally, it has happened also in the British Parliament. Largely, I don't say this as a tribal Tory, although I'm a Conservative Party candidate, largely, I think, because David Cameron put this issue right at the heart of the agenda, and it did stimulate that kind of green competition in Parliament, a competition which ultimately I think we all win.